Thank you everyone for joining. We've got, I guess, 3 agenda items today. As Shane was just mentioning, now an update from the board. Laurie's going to give a discussion on ISO 4201, and then we're going to talk about kind of next steps. But I will hand over to Shane to talk about our favorite slide, antitrust.
Well, one and all, here we are again. We show this antitrust slide at the beginning of every meeting. You'll find the full policy on the Linux Foundation website. And if you're from a member company, you can ask questions of our counsel, Andy Updegrove. The purpose is to ensure we're all clear and comfortable with how we're meeting and to facilitate the type of open collaborative discussion that we find so useful. Back to you, Matthew.
Thank you, and I guess we'll bring up the agenda items, but as I said, we had a board meeting, was it last week now, Shane? And the discussion of the AI study group came up, and the board kind of discussed this. The board discussed the study group, and we kind of came up with some suggestions. And maybe I can just hand over to Shane to summarize the outcomes of that.
Absolutely. So the primary focus of the board meeting was to make a series of decisions around OpenChain strategy, OpenChain budget, and so on. As part of the board meeting, the board takes a look at some of the interesting news items around the project, and naturally the progress of the AI study group was one of those items. So the board was informed about the monthly cadence of workshops and, of course, the work of Matthew and Dave co-chairing. It was pointed out to the board that the AI study group has identified some shared concerns across industries regarding AI compliance. And it was flagged to the board that there's potential emerging consensus for developing a guide to using AI bill of materials for building trust in the supply chain in second half 2024. So the board listened to this, reviewed this, and is broadly supportive of this concept. So the theme of an emerging consensus for developing some form of guide regarding AI bomb in the supply chain is something where the board is fully aware of momentum there and is now prepared, of course, and aware that they may get a request from this study group to become a work group and to formally work on some kind of guide for AI bomb in the supply chain. There's a process for that on the OpenChain website. It's part of the project FAQ. So if anyone goes to our website and clicks on the FAQ, they'll find something called a process for forming new work groups. And I'm just going to put the link to that in the chat. This goes directly to that point in the FAQ. But long story short, a study group can make a proposal to become a work group. The board will have a look at it via their mailing list, and they'll give permission for that conversion within at the moment, 2-week period, with or without questions, and formally ratify it if approved at the next meeting. So pulling those threads together, the board is aware of the great work of the study group, appreciates that work, is aware that there's a certain movement towards consolidating some concerns across industries, and is aware of the emerging consensus that it may be useful to developing a guide to using AI bill of materials in the supply chain. So taking that forward, if that work looks like it's really got potential, if this study group feels we've thought through this, we've workshopped this enough, it's time to become a work group and work on a guide, then a process exists for that conversion. In the meantime, of course, the study group continues to study the question, to chew things over. I hope that summary was clear, and back to you, Matthew.
Thank you so much, Shane. Really appreciate you summarizing the points from the board there. And as Shane pointed out, towards the end there, we still have discussion points, and this will still be evolving. And I will introduce Laurie Grant in a moment. I did just want to check in with people to see if anyone else wanted to add anything to the agenda today before we hand over to Laurie. Hearing none, I can then stop my screen share. I know Laurie has created a few slides. Laurie, do you want to run from your computer, or would you like me to run the slides?
Let me try sharing and see if you can see me.
We can see your Outlook at the moment.
Let's see. I think I don't usually use Zoom. Hold on a sec. Let me make sure I can pick the right screen here. Okay. Okay. Do you see my full share of the OpenChain?
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, terrific. Okay, so you know, I haven't participated a lot in the groups yet. I'm Laurie Grant. I work with Dave Marr and Jeff and Brian. I've been chartered to take a look at how to implement an AI risk management system at Qualcomm, and as part of that, looking closely at ISO 42001 as a implementation, providing implementation guidance that we don't see in a lot of other areas as the regulations are forming. We've taken a close look at that, and we're pursuing ways and means to affect that at Qualcomm. What we've done here is try and connect what ISO can provide us as information for developing the AI bomb, as you say. There's some other deliverables that are interesting here. Impact assessments. I'm not sure if this group would want to dive into that, but there's things here that can inform what we may want to do. So in particular, that sprinkled throughout, you know, there's different clauses and things related to third parties and relationships, but we wanted to hone in on the specific control recommendations as something rather specific. So control, by the way, just for context, is this group well versed in ISO 42001? Or should I consider this group as newer
Jeff
to
and I
it?
talked about ISO 42001 last meeting, sort of a high-level overview of what might be relevant to what we're all looking at, what might be out of scope, what might be missing. I think one of the keys of what you're presenting on today, Laurie, is saying that there is a section specifically on third parties and somewhat supply chains. And I think it'd be nice to dive down into this in a little more detail to understand what's already built out there in the ISO world, and see how we can complement our activity to this.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. So here's the control objective in the upper left here. It talks about making sure that the organization responsibilities are outlined throughout the value chain to ensure that everyone remains accountable and that the right people are responsible for the risks that they control, and to provide visibility throughout the value chain of those risks so that people downstream can mitigate those. So if you take a look at the little graphic in the lower left, ISO sits there as the AI risk management fundamental framework. It provides really the who, what, where, when, why, but it doesn't get into any specifics. So my understanding is that's where OpenChain can get in, maybe talk about a specification for model cards, data cards, and the impact assessment is another deliverable that's key, especially for AI deployers. We might want to consider providing something there as well. You know, when we look across at any kind of standards in this space, there are none. You see data cards like Hugging Face or other companies that are very invested in AI for a long time. Perhaps their best practices, but there isn't anything we can point to say we have a bomb that we can use across. And it sounds like this group is very, very well aware of that. So there's three controls that they talk about. The first one is about allocating responsibilities. You know, it's the fundamental who does what and saying who's going to be responsible for which pieces. It talks about identifying different types of people in the value chain and what their specific responsibilities would be. Then it dives specifically into upstream and downstream suppliers and customers, trying to make sure that we've addressed the things that they need to know to manage the risks in their spaces as defined in the first control. So if you dive down into it, they provide implementation guidance It's very general. It's not again, not the what, but the kind of what you want to accomplish. So they talk about defining the different roles, teasing out who's doing what and what they should be responsible for, what kind of information needs to flow. They reference specific controls B627 and B82 that talks about the kinds of information to be provided, and they're looking for you to reference that as you build this out. And then you get into suppliers, again, teasing out different categories of suppliers and the type of information that should be provided for each of those. And for customers, they're really having you think about what does a customer need to understand as they engage with AI. Everyone knows there's the basic things like marking them as being an AI system fundamentally, and the other things about what kind of risks there might be, what are the appropriate use cases that the system was designed for, trying to provide guidance on use for their specific application. And again, they reference the B6 and B8 clauses. So let me flash those up in the next two slides, and then we can go back and kind of discuss each of these if you'd like. So here's the two clauses that they reference in terms of what to include. So technical documentation, and the general guidance is to include specific things in the technical documentation. They outline what that list looks like. They also talk about a need for change management and document management to keep those things updated and version controlled. In the next one, BA2, they talk about the information to provide to the users to affect those same outcomes for that control. So if you actually look at ISO, the implementation guidance is quite long. It didn't really fit well into a format like this. I can pull it up if you want to see the details, but just know that it, has a long page there that outlines the different pieces and parts we'd want to include. And if we want to think about what that looks like and kind of hone down, maybe even provide sample templates for this, I think isn't a lot of tooling that I've seen out there in industry for this as well. Any kind of guidance we can put together to make this information flow through the chain would be helpful. So with that, do you want to kind of open it up for discussion?
Thanks, Lori. I think it's clear that you have 42001. We've talked about actually the entire specification at a high level, and this focus that you have here on the supply chain piece of it is super helpful actually, because what you have is these pieces that are, in my view, they're more like stubs, because when you look at, let's say, the criteria here, it's like you're considering these issues. You're causing that these materials to be shared, amongst suppliers and also to your customers. But you're not providing through this particular spec. You're not providing any mechanics as to how that handshake should happen. It recognizes that it should happen, it just doesn't provide you detail as to how. And in a software context, we've seen this a lot, where that handshake is going to be sort of where the magic happens, where the inefficiency can get titrated out of the system, provided there's there's a common mode and understanding of doing so. So we've obviously done that work in the context of OpenChain for open source, and by extension, we've also a lot of OpenChain folks have implemented consistent mechanisms on the commercial side as well. So people don't have, let's say, two modes of supply chain software work. It's really all the same work. So the extent that there's pass downs, excuse me, on the commercial side, you also do the same thing on the open source side. When you look at that in the framework of open source, in my opinion, okay, you have a similar bifurcation. You have open source AI models and data sets, but you also have proprietary models, especially. You have a lot of those, but you also have some proprietary data sets as well. So, and I'm using kind of open source in a very broad sense, but but I think that if you have sort of a unified way of dealing with these issues, because from a 42001 perspective, they don't care whether it's open source or commercial. I think our sweet spot is open source, and we start from there. But I think similarly to the way that OpenChain spec was successful as well, we have we started with open source and then grew to commercial. Anyway, that's my view of of the application of 42001 to the potential opportunity in front of us. I'll pause there. Thanks.
I agree with Dave, just picking up on the open source. We've kind of battled with, do we include proprietary open source models or data sets or systems? Let's start with the open source. Let's sort of start with where we know, and then if it's appropriate, build up to that. But it's clearly a niche that OpenChain has experience and expertise in, that we may be able to develop something. I did want to just pick up on the word in the orange box here around OpenChain and how. I guess how we do compliance, and I look to 5230, it doesn't go into that granular detail on the how. It does give some, I don't know, help in terms of create a process for X, Y, and Z, but it doesn't go into how it goes into it. I guess the question to the group and to Laurie or others, what level of granularity do we want to get into with this? It's clearly it gives us an opportunity to work out how deep we want to go in with that how option.
I think I was hoping to hear what the group was thinking was appropriate, being new to the team, really seeking your insights.
And maybe again we start with a certain level, and we can see whether that is enough, whether we want to add further specifics. It can be
I
up
think
for
one of
debating.
one of the things that we've been talking about is, do we leverage and maybe refer to standards like XPDX or AI bomb, as example implementation frameworks. So in terms of the how, perhaps that's the integration point.
I couldn't agree with you more on that.
Hi, yes, hand from Prasad.
Hi, thanks, Dave. Yeah, I think taking a cue from the previous specifications and how we played out with regards to specific on how, it does make sense to give that, or at least kind of empower that to the respective organizations on the how part, because that's obviously going to be closely implemented or associated with their respective implementations, and sometimes it does depends on the type of usage, not only just what are the type of tools that they are looking at, like the AI tools, but also the usage of these tools can vary across various organizations. But I do like the idea that I think Laurie earlier mentioned about can we baseline somewhere? So the baselining could be somewhere at an existing standard out there that supports AI profile or data profile, which is what SPDX obviously supports. So maybe we can have something to baseline off, and then obviously leave it to the respective organizations to build on top of it. So I'm more looking for what are the minimal elements of that SBOM that we may want to recommend, but then how they want to incorporate that, it's a little bit up to the respective organizations on how they want to implement. That's my thought.
Just building on that, Prasad, we thinking of a level where OpenChain could say, a process could exist for creating an AI bill of materials. For example, a model, could include a license, instructions for deployment, etc. But how you do this could be like SPDX's AI profile or Hugging Face's AI bomb.
Right. So take maybe a set of, not the whole set, but at least certain minimal set of elements. So, for example, when it comes to the AI model, is there a licensing? Is that model supported by a license? And if so, what is the what are the obligations, right? So at least kind of that is covered there. And then the other aspect is, what is the data set? Like, can we get some highlight on the data set and the data sets associated license? That could be captured. Of course, in some cases, if the model cannot, or if it's a closed model, then you probably will have the data set available, but or maybe a data set you may not have much information, but at least you need to know, is there an additional maybe is that being trained with the RAG? Then do we get some information on the RAG data? So that is something that I think you need to at least have something baseline. So that will help. If somebody looks at the specification, they will know at least, okay, hey, this is the model, here is some preliminary data set that is associated with it. Either it could be just, for the base model training data set, or it could be the additional like RAG that gets augmented on top of the model. That could be something that we can baseline as a recommendation.
Hey, Prasad, that term RAG, that you just used, it's a term of art within the AI space. I just, can you talk about that a little bit more, since we haven't really talked about that here?
Oh yeah, sure. My apologies. I thought it's okay. So yeah, RAG is essentially retrieval augmentation generation. So this is more of an operation that AI models, like when you're using that in a practical sense, any AI model, especially with generative AI, you incorporate that, or you take this model and use it in your products. Many cases, the base model alone as such may not really know, or may not have sufficient understanding of your context. So you might be taking the base model and incorporating it for a number of functions or capabilities for your respective product. And in some cases where you need extreme closeness to the context, so how do you incorporate that context? So they have this several techniques. I think one such technique is the RAG technique. And so what they in RAG technique they do is they have actual data source databases, typical query and response mechanism by which you incorporate some of these specific contextual information on top of the output from the base model. You augment that to your overall generative output. So in other words, the RAG trained base model, when it comes out, the output will be a lot more context sensitive as opposed to the raw output that's going to come out of your base model. So this is a very common technique used, or at least one of the popular mechanisms used when it comes to leveraging AI models in the practical sense, primarily Gen AI models, especially with multimodal models that uses attention mechanisms. So it's very important to kind of at least have some understanding of that RAG data, the actual database from where you are pulling these contextual information. And that data could be very well associated with potential license-related aspects that we need to abide by, because the derivatives that's going to come out of that model could be potentially subjected to the similar obligation as the actual original data itself. So that's my point. Hope, Dave, is that make sense?
That's great. And I'll give just a very quick example of that. So this retrieval augmented generation capability, it's something in the Qualcomm sense we look at as customization. So it's a reference, that's app for training is done. And so for example, if I'm walking down the street, I want to ask my model, please recommend a restaurant. My personal RAG, will have, knowledge that say that I'm vegetarian. I'm not. My choices are horrible. But it would be like, okay, I'm going to recommend vegetarian restaurants, because it's going to reference the RAG as it generates that output to refine that output that's customized to the application that's in front of it. That's just an example of it. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. I think that's a very good example, and I mean that there could be additionally a number of contexts that you can infuse. So again, from a OpenChain specification, I think in terms of how we want to incorporate could be flexible, but at least trying to get some baselining done, both with respect to the model as well as the data. The base set of elements that we want to specify or baseline on would be a first good step.
Something that I think we'll want to keep in mind as we decide what OpenChain or our sweet spot is here versus other places is NIST has identified this space as a priority for standards. They call it transparency among AI actors about system and data characteristics. They see that model cards and data cards are a place where there is some practices in place, and so they feel it's right for prioritizing the standards around AI. So I think we need to try and watch the direction they're heading and see how this work here complements that in terms of referencing that in addition to 42001.
Anyone got any more comments on this, on the how?
We talked about AI bomb a couple of times. I think we have, we can probably spend more time and get into like the different flavors of AI bombs that are out there, and kind of like do a I don't know if we can get someone to present on the different flavors of it. There's a conversation that's happening offline with SPDX, and we can perhaps approach SPDX to see if there are obviously a sister project of ours within the Linux Foundation to see if we could have a discussion there. But I think with OpenChain, we landed at a point where, yes, of course, we wanted to make sure that we worked with SPDX in terms of how the spec worked. But we were agnostic as to choice, so people could actually pick proprietary SBOM standards. Then and as long as it provided the compliance artifacts downstream, then it would be fine. But I think we could probably spend a little more time as a team discussing what those AI bombs look like. And I don't know if we're going to be able to get to a point of like compare contrast, but I think that might be an interesting and supportive exercise as we go down this path. And I'm okay with that being, if we decide to go down the path of a work group, then we can do that there as well. But I do think that a more in-depth discussion about that would be helpful.
Tiffany, you've raised your hand.
Yeah, thanks. Just kind of going back to the how in that little orange box, one of the pieces that was perhaps a little bit more new was the impact assessment. I think, to my knowledge so far, we've really discussed in terms of like the model card, data card parallels. So the impact assessments, I think, is a little bit new. It's interesting. It's, for a lot of us are probably also tasked with looking at that and tracking that, but I didn't know. Maybe Lori, if you had more details on the thinking there, and if that's something that we should discuss in terms of the scope of this project.
In terms of what is an impact assessment?
No, or how that might fit into kind of the open chain initiative and building trust down the supply chain. From what I'm
Yeah.
tracking, it's, there's not an answer yet. There's not a form. There's supposed to be things, at least from the EUAI Act, of different types of models, similar to the, data cards, right? You can have a totally different set of lists. And in these conversations, we've discussed more like what are the pieces of information, the artifacts that would be helpful for the supply chain to build that kind of trust. An impact assessment is an interesting one. Similarly, is would that mean that we provide answers to very commonly asked questions that occur in a lot of the proposed impact assessments? Or I guess what's kind of the thinking there of how that could fit into this kind of initiative in terms of, the information to supply in the supply chain?
Yeah, I think when you thanks for the question. I think when you take a look at, across all the regulations, globally, you're seeing the three key deliverables that flow through the chain are the model cards, data cards, and impact assessments. And so that's why I included it, at least for discussion here. If we want to make sure that the right information is passing through the supply chain, that is one of the key elements that's required for at least deployers, clearly, of AI systems. And then, the data cards and model cards might feed information into that impact assessment. It's a little unclear whether a full impact assessment is required for just a developer, but definitely deployers need to have that information, and it flows all the way through. So if you think about a deployer, the definition of what an AI deployer means is not abundantly clear either. So you may have an AI system that's deployed and then picked up by someone else downstream and used to develop another AI system. So I think that's where you get the chain as part of the chain reaction, if you will, of the deliverables flowing through. Is that the nature of your question, or did I answer it?
Got it.
And
Yeah.
then,
No, I think for me, it was just kind of figuring out, like, are we using the data, is the data card, model card, mechanism that enables someone downstream to perform their own impact assessment? Or do we think that the trend will be that actually, models will come with like with an impact assessment sheet answered, filled out, if there is an evolution towards standardization, or if that would be more helpful to instill trust beyond a data card.
I think
It's an
that's
interesting
what
question.
it is. And I think, I don't know if Dave or someone from my team or Brian can chime in on this with more knowledge, but from what I've seen, it's really unclear what that looks like in the chain. But there is that potential as it becomes more clear. And I think that's perhaps what we can do is provide the clarity where we lack it, in handing that off. So if you have, again, a model that's a foundational model and you hand off an impact assessment and somebody picks up a foundational model and then applies that to a specific use case, and then that use case has an assessment. It's like where are impact assessments required and where are they not? And in what use cases do we need to provide them downstream? So if you have an AI model that has a specific capability, and then you pick up that model, and let's say you implement it for a specific use case, and then somebody grabs it and modifies it for a more nuanced use case. There could be a chain of development as you go through and pick up different pieces and parts. There still is some ambiguity around what an AI deployer really means. And I think honing in and articulating when you need these and when you don't would be very helpful. And then just laying out the requirements, as one of the folks said earlier on the call. What are the minimum requirements? When you look at regulations, every regulation says it a little bit differently. They say it different things are needed. Some things are foundational. Teasing out what is that minimum set for, I think the word baseline was used earlier, would be very helpful. And in different use cases, when is different information needed? What are your thoughts on that?
Great, thanks for that. I think even the one of the things you said that I really liked was like even just identifying when you need an impact assessment, even just that scoping is a lot and might actually even be valuable, even if it's not, even if it doesn't go into the actual impact assessments, at least for, in my perspective, the timing of, you know, if this group wants to kick up to a working group, you know, a lot of these things can't be answered yet anyhow, right? Are still evolving, but I think even having a mind towards that, and following it in terms of when those might be required is interesting, but probably not maybe something that can be, because the regulations are evolving, you know, an actual you know, at the same level of where we're at with data cards and model cards for an AI bomb, perhaps. But an
You know,
interesting concept to think about.
and I think I'm glad you pulled the thread on this, because one of the things to mention is where I see the OpenChain charter really coming into play here and being valuable is the ability for companies to reference whatever we may come up with and say, I am compliant with, the OpenChain capability, whatever we decide that needs to be in terms of passing these artifacts through the chain, that they have the mechanisms in place to be able to do that if you engage with them. So if I pick you up as a partner or a supplier, I can count on you to be responsible with your AI, and I can count on you to provide me the deliverables I need so that I can also be accountable. Because I think a big challenge here is regulators are coming out fast and hard, relatively fast and hard on this because of the risk level. And to think that, the EUA Act is going to go into force in a year from now and require all high-risk systems to have all these mature artifacts with high level of documentation and governance. And to think that the, you know, ecosystem across the world at different levels of, size and capability can pivot on a dime and do that isn't realistic. And so as we start to think about who out there has these capabilities and can be a good partner because they are able to be, uh, responsible with their AI, will become more and more important as we get towards those, regulations coming into force.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, in fact, actually, I pulled up a presentation. Let me just share one slide to try to talk through, a piece of this. Hopefully, do you guys see a screen share?
Yep, we can see, Dave.
Okay. All right. Cool. All right. So this is a presentation, or the slide that we talked about, some meetings ago. But when we talk about impact assessment, you've got on the left-hand side of the slide, you've got these different data sources that are, pulled together to form what would be the canonical data set for the training. And you actually handle the data card piece either at this combined level, or more functionally, it's ideally, each data source would have its own data card, so, data source 1 through data source N, because then you wouldn't have to figure out, all the issues of like data set and sub data set issues. And Jeff Kettle on my team is, he's the expert on this stuff. But when you have a data set, what you have is you have less an impact. You have more a set of considerations. And so you have, that there's a disclosure as to how that data was collected, typically, or some limitations as to how the data set was subsetted, in which case, people then who are doing training need to know that the data set might be incomplete in some ways, or a little bit myopic, or a little bit, more focused, on certain types of applications that might not suit, the intended purpose of the model. And then next on the right-hand side, you have the model actually getting trained. And the model, you might have then more of an impact assessment that would be applying there, because you're getting closer to building an AI system, but you haven't built an AI system yet. So the model, you might say, it has limitations as well, and these are the recommended ways to to mitigate the choices that were made by the trainers around the data set, and here are the things that it might be more suitable for. But these might be disclosed in a model card. And it could actually be, instead of these data cards or model cards, it could actually be more robust, like scholarly articles, a paper or something where the person wants to disclose more information and in-depth context. But then eventually, as you get to the right, and I'll talk about that. So, the box on top would be if you have let's say a cloud, based thing. So now you've got this user interacting with the model, and then that back propagation is an option to, for the system provider to be like, okay, I want to take the prompts from the user and use that as also back propagation for training purposes. So the model gets, refined, with the ongoing prompts from the users. So that's, at that point, when you've deployed it to users, now you have an AI system. And at that point, for sure, somebody needs to be giving thought to, the impact assessment. But that's really, where you're at. And then if you then take that model and you do, instead of deploying it in your own cloud, you actually deliver to somebody. Now you're in the, you're truly in the supply chain, and an impact assessment on the right-hand side, here, is probably more acutely of interest. Now, to Tiffany's point, we are still in a nascent stage as to what is the obligation, in terms of compliance with certain acts that are already out there that are trending towards more robustness and more guidance as we start getting closer to, certain trigger dates for the effectiveness of the obligation. So we've got sort of an evolving space there. But I think if I were to go back to Lori's slide and sort of think about that, I think it would be data cards, model cards. Those are already practices that are expectations in place, and we should probably refine those. And there's an opportunity to streamline that activity. The impact assessment, I would say, is maybe I would call it more of a question mark as to how and when, because to Tiffany's point, the guidance on that is light as to how that transmits through the supply chain. And we don't want to be too heavy-handed and force that to be an early function, because as I'm trying to describe in this diagram, as you go left, you have less of an impact assessment to make, more of a disclosure to make. Hope that helps. I'm trying to stop sharing, but I'm sufficiently unfamiliar with Zoom. Oh, I found it. Okay.
Thanks, Dave. Does anyone have any comments for Dave? Prasad, your hand is raised.
Yes. So I think I agree, Dave. I think that diagram that you just shared was helpful. As I think the left of the diagram, what you are specifying more towards the information pertaining to the data card and the model itself. And then as you tend to go towards right, you have more and more operational aspects comes into picture in terms of, more like, let's say, model inventory management, right? So that's where I think potentially when it comes to impact assessment, that might lead to, like, so if you have, let's say, if you want to assess the scope of impact of a given model and its data set across your organization, how do you go about doing that? And obviously there is some level of, I would say, discipline at some point that the organizations have to do. And again, this could be varying. And that's where I think I agree with your assessment that, we don't want to right away start with, expecting heavy enforcement in that area, but rather can we at least kind of at a high level, say that this, by having some level of base inventory management to take care of, like at least to understand or to catalog these models could be maybe a good start, because having that catalog in place for each organization could be quite valuable in itself, let alone the much more additional leveraging that they can do at a later point by maybe even drawing out dependency graph and whatnot, right? I mean, that happens all the time on the open source world, where you do have ability to track these dependencies in a much more thorough way. But at least having somewhere to start with, saying, hey, does this organization, by having adopting the standard, do they have a base inventory system? Or it doesn't have to be even a system, but it's some sort of a mechanism for them to specify and uniquely identify the models. Or is it even too much? That is something that we need to think about. In my opinion, I think having that base system to kind of catalog these models, I think that could definitely help in the future to further expand into that space of impact assessment at a later point. That's what I think.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that makes sense. And then, if I can, let me share one more screen here. Right. Okay, so what I'm sharing here, this is the this is just a web page. This is the bill of materials guidance at GitHub. Actually, okay, sorry. It's not GitHub. This is one person's view of it. But the direction that I was thinking about, maybe would make sense for us is kind of the way this is framed over here, where it's less, about, requiring an impact assessment. If it's required under a given regulatory framework, it's required. People will need to follow that to the extent that applies to them. But in terms of sharing the documentation of this information, this perhaps should be option and maybe gently encouraged, but not mandated as part of our specification. Would be perhaps more like, to the extent that you consider this impact assessment to be a artifact, then the artifact should be transmitted in a certain way so that it's consumable downstream. And then there's going to be issues, around, whether or not you can just pass it down, which is something that I would be frankly attracted to. If we're ingesting, let's say, a comprehensive paper, that's 20 pages long, and that is really, where the disclosures are taking place, by me trying to summarize it into a pithy, let's say, data card, I would probably do a significant disservice to people downstream that are really interested in getting that depth. So it might be that it's just, further passing down of such information that was received from original sources.
Dave, you pick up on a point there that it's almost like a two-tier approach. We could almost have a minimum bit of information to help out, and then a more detailed paper, as you highlight, to go into all of these details in more with more scrutiny.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is that kind of what you're thinking of there?
Yeah. And if we were to look at this layered approach, right, we're already talking about, 42001, as sort of almost like, the leading ISO specification on AI. And in fact, it's the one that's being referenced, in the context of a lot of other activities, especially with the AI Act, where it's not 100%, but it's like they're recognizing that is a key ingredient. But then if we say the supply chain piece of it would be potentially a layer on top, which would be probably something that I think ISO would like, because it's consistent with the way that ISO likes to layer its standards. Then, if we say within our piece on the top that there's the core, and then there's also this optionality piece on it that provides flexibility to work with different regulatory regimes. Perhaps that is sufficiently flexible for us to be able to deliver something that would be useful to supply chains worldwide on AI. Okay, I'll stop my screen share because I can't see if there's questions or anything coming up.
There's nothing on the chat, Dave, but just open it up for comments or questions on this topic.
Just to confirm, Dave, just the specific requirements you just shared from the GitHub for the AI bomb requirements. I think is that so. By saying that specific, like the base, like the documentation. I mean that's a little bit more detailed, but having that basic information for each of these models, that's essentially what you're talking about, is having some level of inventory system or some sort of inventory data of these models, but not make it mandatory, but more of a recommendation is what you are proposing, right?
Yeah, almost like the concept of encouraging is maybe the strongest we really need to say on that issue. And if it's required, it's required. I think we should reserve space for frameworks where it is required, and how it's going to be required is going to be a TBD, because it's, to the prior conversation, it's new space.
Yeah.
But we certainly don't want that, to create an inefficiency. To the extent it is required, or someone wants to provide it, let's make it a consumable way to do it, through the supply chain.
Yeah. Makes sense.
I just want to go back to Laurie. Did you finish your slides? Was there anything else you wanted to share with us?
I did.
Great. Thank
Any
you
other
again.
thoughts on that? Yeah. Any other thoughts before we close the topic?
Thanks, Laurie. So my big takeaway is is acknowledging that things like this supply chain discussion in 42001 exist, and that as we build out a framework, we perhaps point to that as existing and as a way to be compliant, but to avoid duplicating that content into any sort of work product we produce.
Agreed, and I guess we need to put that in part of our review to make sure that there is this kind of supplementary work that we're doing for the supply chain, rather than just, I guess, utilizing things that are already out there in this ISO standard.
Yeah, and there's a little bit of, ISO web, spider web going on there. The 4201 refers to other standards that talk a little more specifically about what goes into these. So, it's a matter of making that a little bit more digestible and in compliance with things across the globe. So there's the 4201, then there will be the forthcoming guidance that I think we'll see coming out for model cards and data cards specifically as a priority. The there's a 22, is it 894 that it references? So kind of, 22989, and then there's another 22, I forget the number, 8 something. So there's a couple different things to take a look at as we distill down what, to Brian's point, what's already in the standards, and then what do we layer on top? So there's don't want to oversimplify it by saying it's just the 42001. There's a couple other threads to pull as we see what's out there.
Great. If it's okay with everyone, maybe we can move on to the next agenda item. And hearing no objections, I will share my screen. So we talked briefly last time around ISO 5230 and starting to build up some form of document for the study group. We saw, and Shane explained earlier, that the kind of board is certainly supporting us producing some form of guide. We've had great discussions here today, which I think will help augment that guide, but maybe we need to start writing some of these things down in terms of a scratch pad. So Shane has very kindly created a shared document, and I'm hoping you can see my screen with two documents on. Could someone just confirm that for me? Or
Yes.
can you see?
Confirmed.
Great, thank you. So I have here on the left-hand side the work that we did in previous AI study group meetings where we took ISO standard 5230. And if you recall, we went through clause by clause to say there are things here that we can probably lift and shift. This is more around setting up what good, I think, housekeeping looks like in terms of there should be a policy about something. We should have people's roles and responsibilities captured. And some of these points were brought up in today's sessions. So I guess what we've done is taken the things that seemed relevant according to the audiences that have reviewed this and put it in this document on the right-hand side. All this information is available. The sessions were recorded on previous AI study group sessions, and then these working documents are in a working folder that I think, Shane, we can either share around or have already been shared around. We can certainly do that afterwards as well, but we've kind of got this working scratch pad, if you will, where, as I said, we've copied, lifted and shifted a number of the clauses that would just seem quite logical around, as I said, policy, and we've changed the words open source to AI and kind of tweaked it around a little bit. I think it would be good for us to review this, go offline, have a read, comment on it. But I do want to kind of build on the section around the AI bill of materials, which I've kind of been reviewing based on the comments that we've said in the past. So as I said, a bit about policy, competence, awareness, rationale, a bit about license, obligations that may or may not be relevant, and we can come back to talk about this. Access of a model if there's any queries coming back to a company for sort of accountabilities. And then it's this section here that I want to kind of discuss a bit more. And this is probably where we can add some value in explaining that how. And these were just, I guess, some thoughts based on comments that I've said in previous study groups. This is open for discussion, debate. There's nothing in here that I think is, can't be changed or modified based on discussions. And it's up to the study group whether we want to use this as a bit of a working session and start modifying these things, whether people just want to listen and review and come back to it, say, for the next session. But this AI bill of materials section, I think, and I'm hoping it's large enough that you can read, that we have a process for creating and managing an AI bill of materials. And I've tried my best and probably very poorly separated into model and data sets. and just listening to conversations, as I said before. So model details could include things around the license, how we deploy it, how to stop the model if it's malfunctioning, ownership, liability, and limitations of the models, and also use cases, including anything that's out of scope. And then I like Dave's point earlier on around data sets. Originally, I had this as training, testing, validation, and other data sets, but maybe we just have data set as a high level concept. We cover things like what the license is under, what the data set could be used for, how it was collected, what the intended purpose of it is. And we can create n number of data set documents. And then to, I think it was Prasad's point earlier on, apologies if it was somebody else, but highlighting the fact that, yes, we can create these, or we think we should have a process for capturing this information, but how it is done and maybe what format it is, that could be with SPDX, Hugging Face, or other related SBOMs that utilize other brands, I guess. I'll pause in a moment, but there's some verification of how this is achieved, I guess, is an overlap of what we've done from TUF 5230. So I'll open it up to the floor for discussion. People's thoughts, comments on this type of scratchpad. Are we nearly there to start working on said document? And what are people's thoughts on it?
It might be a lot for people to digest and respond to right away, but I like what I'm seeing, Matthew. This is stylistically, we're building on what we have before. I probably would suggest we think about like what's already in 42001 and see what we can reference within that for any pieces. Unlike 5230, we have a little bit less of a greenfield on this one.
Yep.
But we still do have, I think, a significant opportunity.
Agreed. And just picking up on the nuance of your point there, are you suggesting that we just say refer to 5230 when thinking about some of these fields, or are you saying we should lift and shift?
Let's say, I think there's certain pieces that we can basically reference back. For example, well, I don't know. I need to have a look at it.
Yeah, sure.
Did you use compliance artifact as a definition? Because I think that might be useful.
I think I've got artifact in there, but this is all open for discussion. As you said, Dave, this is new to everyone, and maybe it's an opportunity to either go through it slightly more slowly, or people can take this away and we can come back next time for comment and review.
So I like your phrasing of lift and shift, and just from my personal perspective, I'm open to everyone's opinion, of course. Here is, I think it might make sense to lift and shift from 5230 to maybe restate some of those requirements, but with the lens of an AI system as opposed to an open source license. In contrast, I think that would not be appropriate for 42001 because that is already on the nose for AI. I think for that we point in directs I see here for existing frameworks.
That's a great point. It's great that people are already looking at this document themselves. I can see people going in. I'd like to kind of end the call maybe at the bottom of the hour. I know some people need to go, so we do have, say, 20 minutes. What do people want to do with this time? Would people like to walk through this and provide comment? Or would people like to go away and digest this and come back next time?
Personally, I think I'd do better going offline. then coming back and then going through this. The reason why is because I think I kind of need two specs in front of me. One is 42001 and then 5230. Actually, you know what? Let me ask the group of this question. Does everybody have a copy of 42001? You know, I'm not offering that I can provide a copy because ISO restricts, you know, like they make their money by selling copies of the spec. And actually, you know what, Shane, can I put you on the spot with a question? You know, when we did OpenChain 5230, and we got it through ISO, and then we had the free version of that specification on our OpenChain project website. Did that raise any hackles at ISO?
Not at all. Not at all. We got no negative feedback on that. So fundamentally, when it came to building our ISO standards, we built them from our existing industry standards. We own the root copyright and we're the source of truth. But beyond that, as we went through the ISO process, we published our copy of the draft international standard format. So we had prepared that. We created the formatting of our industry standard into the formal ISO standard, and that was our own copyrighted material. That is very close to what ISO published, purposefully so. Yep, anyway, no hackles, no problems, no issues at all. Part of that may be because of our workflow. Naturally, other standards are developed in other ways. The copyright lies with other people.
I see. Okay, great. That makes sense. Yeah, so I've got a licensed copy of 42001 that I plan to reference as I look at this, the scratch pad that you kindly put together, Matthew. Do other folks generally have that as well? Or are we? I don't want to create a barrier for people to be able to participate. And maybe there's other ways for us to do it if people, not everybody has a copy of it or is unable to acquire a copy.
Perhaps it makes sense if we can have, I don't know, Shane, or we can help have someone from the operations side, like try to put this in a common share. At least the 42,001 and then the other one, the 5230. There is also a relative, I think we are talking about SPDX, so it might be worthwhile to bring the 5286 also into that, and at least have reference link from our Linux Foundation website.
So I think the concern here, Prasad, is I think we own the IP rights to 5230, and we can probably get a copy of that. But for 4201, I certainly don't have a permission from ISO to distribute freely to even a closed group like this. So I don't think I could put something in a shared area. Maybe others have that permission from them. But I certainly don't, and I think that's what Dave is trying to get at. If we do this side-by-side comparison, is that fair for everybody?
Yeah.
I also have a copy, but it's just the unfortunate way, or fortunate way, depending on how you look at it, that ISO standard access is handled. So I guess it's a complication we will have to work through. Eventually we'll have to compare them. If people don't have access to that, that's unfortunate, but I don't really see an easy way around it unless we can get ISO to waive that, but I'm not seeing them doing that anytime soon.
Just to flag, as mentioned, the key issue is who's the copyright holder with distribution rights. So we host 5230 and our other ISO standard 18974. It's security. It's not directly relevant to what's being discussed here. We host a very close parallel to the ISO versions on our website. I can certainly provide links to that and so on and so forth. But no, we can't host other people's ISO standards. Once it's published on the ISO website, that version is ISO copyright. And they have a store selling the standards. So, you know, it's a revenue stream for them. It's a purposeful process. 4201 is 194 Swiss francs. If some people can't get it through their corporate channels, especially members of my board or my work group chairs, of course, OpenChain can assist with that. But we can't make it generally available. It's not ours.
Yeah, I think even that's fine. I mean, I know at least some of us, at least maybe including myself, I do have access through the commercial license we have for ISO through my organization, but for the purpose of this forum, you know, even if there is the closest version that you mentioned, Shane, if that there is a reference link, those can be added. I think that might be helpful. But again, I leave it up to how feasible it is to do that, and maybe it might be not worthwhile to do that if those versions that are, not the actual copyrighted versions, but the ones that are close enough, is that going to be really helpful? That's a question, right? I think if that is not the case, then it makes sense for not to share them.
I guess what we can do, Matthew, this is a suggestion to you and also to you, Dave. With regards to Prasad's suggestion, perhaps in the Scratchpad, we could add links to the standards. I mean, for the OpenChain standard and also our sister project SPDX, OpenChain hosts a version of our standard. I'll need to check if SPDX does. Yes, I believe they do. They don't hold an ISO formatted version, but they hold the equivalent version in their original format on their website. So we can link to those, and then we can link to the ISO web store for the standards that cost money. And we can add a note, for example, if you need some help getting with these standards, contact us. And while we can't buy a standard for everyone, we can certainly lend a hand, especially in a smaller group like this, if necessary.
Thanks, Shane. Well, I think that's kind of actions for us all for this next month. Take this document, we'll send it round, we'll send the link round. I know Shane's put it in the chat already. Send the link round, have a review of it, compare it with 4201 and 5230 and others, and just your own expertise and comments. And maybe we can come back in a month's time and just walk through this document and get people's thoughts and comments and see where we go. And as I highlighted at the start, I don't think anything is off the table or written in stone that we can't modify and expand on. And maybe we focus less on the specific words, but just the concepts for the next session. So if there are things that you think are missing or you don't feel as though you would be interested in, let's kind of capture those.
That sounds good.
Well, if that's the case, then was there any final comments from anyone or any other business?
Just flagging that I posted in the chat just to say that getting to this point already is a terrific accomplishment. Not only the board is appreciative of the time invested, but we just held community meetings in Korea, Japan, and China in that order. And everyone was both talking about AI, but also appreciated all the work being done here. Whether or not future activities take this study group in the direction of a work group, whether or not there's a guide made, other materials made, I think it's important to acknowledge that where we've already come is a big deal, and huge thanks for that investment. And certainly there's market demand for this discussion and potential solutions to be further discussed. I came across nothing but great interest as we held all those community meetings in the last 2 weeks.
Thanks for that, Shane. Much appreciated comments from what you're seeing in the landscape of OpenChain. If there's no other business, I propose that we close the meeting and we meet again in a month's time.
Sounds good.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.